Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. So, I'm going to start off with a few questions here and then I'll see if I can answer them as I proceed. So, what separates us from machines? What separates us from other animals? And maybe the harder question, what separates us from each other? So, today's episode is about cognition, not just intelligence, not just memory, but cognition in the deepest sense. How we make meaning, how we build shared worlds, and why language might be the quiet architecture holding it all together. So let's start with AI. There's a lot of noise about artificial intelligence becoming more human, and that makes me think of the White Zombie song, More Human Than Human. You know, so that song's chorus might be caught in my head for the rest of the day. But anyway, AI, it writes, it reasons, it solves problems, it can remember things. In some domains, it outperforms us even. But here's the fundamental divide: AI processes patterns, humans experience. And there's a whole world of difference between those things. That difference matters more than it first appears, in fact. AI can analyze language, but it doesn't feel confusion. It can describe grief, but it has never lost anyone. It can simulate self reflection, but there's no lived center behind the words, no embodied perspective, no first person I. So human cognition is rooted in lived experience. We don't just process information, we inhabit it. Our thoughts are shaped by bodies that get tired, nervous systems that react, emotions that color perception. Meaning is not just calculated, it's actually felt. And that absence of embodied subjective experience creates a profound gap between machine cognition and ours. AI excels at statistical pattern recognition, but it does not understand in the way that we do. Now let's shift from machines to other animals. Many animals have impressive cognitive abilities, sure. Chimpanzees can use tools, they can plan ahead to some degree. Crows recognize individual human faces, according to studies, and they even hold grudges. Memory and problem solving are not uniquely human, and that's an interesting fact, right? But there's another divide here. While animals can learn, innovate, and remember in general, most of them, what they know dies with them. And why is that? Because they lack a shared symbolic system like language. Now, I'm sure you could find some elements of language in non human animals, and it's debatable what actually constitutes a language, but it seems like practically everyone agrees that other animals do not have language in the same extent, to the same degree that we have it. Humans don't just experience the world, we encode it, we externalize it, we turn it into words, symbols, diagrams, and stories, and that changes everything. Language allows us to build cumulative culture. If I discover something, I can describe it, you can refine it, someone else can improve it, and generations later that knowledge still exists. It doesn't vanish when I do, or at least it's not supposed to. Obviously, there will be a time when the entire solar system might be gone, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. And compare that ability that I just described to a chimpanzee discovering a clever way to fish for termites. That innovation can spread through imitation, and other chimpanzees might copy it. And researchers have documented dozens of distinct regional termite fishing techniques. It'd be kind of interesting to watch a documentary on that or something, but so, there is transmission, there is variation, there is something we can call culture, but it's still limited. Without symbolic language, that technique can't be abstracted into a principle. It can't be debated, it can't be written down, systematized, or integrated into a broader framework of knowledge, at least, not in a capacity that's comparable to humans. It remains a useful trick, not a building block in a technological tradition. So there's no accumulated body of theory, no historical narrative explaining who invented it and why, no shared archive that grows over centuries. And in humans, language is not just about communication, it's the architecture of collective thought. It allows us to store memory outside of the brain in books, in rituals, in laws, in myths, in databases. We've essentially built a distributed cognitive system that can span generations. And that's impressive. You can bash human beings all day long, but really, there are some impressive aspects of being human, and it's unfortunate to see some of those get jeopardized by human stupidity. I'm just going to throw that into the narrative here. So, this is what makes cumulative cultural evolution possible. Innovations don't just appear, they stack up over time. And that stacking depends on something critical: the ability to symbolize, to let a sound stand for an idea, to let a mark stand for a sound, and to let a story stand for a shared identity. So, our capacity for language is deeply rooted in biology. It's influenced by genetic factors and supported by specialized brain structures. It co evolved with our social complexity, and over time it became the foundation for symbolic thinking. And from symbolic thinking, culture explodes. Stories, laws, religions, science, history, all of that stuff. But here's where it gets a little bit more intimate. Language does not just build civilizations, it builds selves. So think about that too, like how much of your own self is actually built by language and by culture and by those who came before you. So that's why it's important sometimes to use your brain, because you do have that ability to question how you got to where you are. And you might realize that not everything about the surrounding culture is actually sound. Some of it might be false, and some of it might be built on dangerous ideas, even. And sure, doing that might make you a rebel if you call those things into question, but that's partly why we have brains too. We can evolve, we can change, we can determine things about ourselves that the rest of the society might not have decided. That's a pretty fascinating thing, and it really does actually also happen on an individual level to some degree. And think about yourself. If I ask you, tell me about yourself, what do? You don't just list raw data, you tell a story more than likely. You select memories, you connect events, you explain turning points, you frame struggles as lessons, and you imply a direction for the future. Well, most likely, I mean, depending on how long the conversation lasts. You might not have all day, but it's possible that you could tell a pretty winding road of a narrative. And that's, a surprising part of the human experience, is that we all have a story to tell. And psychologist Dan McAdams calls these personal myths. Not myths as in falsehoods, but myths as in meaning making narratives. We construct internal life stories that give our experiences coherence. Sorry, I kind of got jumbled up with my sentence there. But anyway, without that narrative thread, life would feel like disconnected episodes, random moments with no arc. Stories bind our past, present, and the imagined future into something continuous. They give us identity that stretches beyond the immediate moment. And here's the deeper contrast. For apes, the world is rich and immediate, full of sensation and social nuance, but it is largely unmoored from a collectively articulated past or a jointly imagined future. There's no shared historical narrative spanning generations, no collaborative design for distant futures. That's one of the things that sets us apart from, you know, other primates. Their consciousness may be deeply individual, each life a vivid island, and humans at our best we build continents. But here's the twist. That shared continent of meaning is not automatic. Philosophers and writers have long pointed out that we can feel like islands too, each of us trapped inside a private stream of consciousness. William James described consciousness as a stream that's continuous and flowing, but even he acknowledged how easily experience can feel fragmented. William Golding in Lord of the Flies described characters as two continents of experience and feeling unable to communicate. The tragedy wasn't violence alone in that story, it was the breakdown of shared meaning. The island metaphor captures something real. Each of us has a radically subjective perspective. No one else has your exact memories, your emotional associations, your internal dialogue. In that sense, we are like separate islands if you really think about it. So that's one of the dangers of being isolated, too isolated. And that's one of the reasons why I try to sometimes, step outside of my room and actually sometimes do social events and whatnot. Connection requires effort. Bridges have to be built. Language has to be used carefully. Well, I suppose it doesn't have to, but it's wise to use it carefully. And that's because misunderstandings happen. At its worst, this isolation becomes a kind of mental prison, a cramped space where we assume no one can truly understand us, where shared reality feels impossible. But here's the hopeful part. I don't want to just be bleak. The very existence of language suggests that isolation is not necessarily our final fate or our final state. We're not born into a continent of meaning, we build it through conversation, through stories, through shared symbols. AI can simulate dialogue, but it does not stand on that continent. It has no inherited myths, no childhood mysteries, and no childhood memories, no cultural lineage it belongs to. Animals share immediate worlds of perception and behavior, but they do not collectively author history. And humans do. We are the species that remembers together, that plans together, argues about the past, designs future that none of us will even live to see. And that may be the defining feature of our cognition, not just about intelligence, but about a continent made of stories. It's not just memories, not just narratives, but actually the stories that those all contribute to. And every time we speak, write, or listen carefully, we're potentially adding another piece of land